Hello everyone, and welcome to Potomac Valley Audubon Society's monthly program. I'm Casey Johnson. I work as a land management technician for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service outside of Shepherdstown, West Virginia at the National Conservation Training Center. And we're here today to discuss my own backyard greenhouse and some of the considerations it took for me to build this finished product. So with that, let's have a look, shall we? So first section, we're going to talk about site prep. These are the general considerations someone needs to consider when they're first setting up and figuring out how they want their greenhouse to look, feel, act, all that. First, of course, most important is location. Where is it sited, and is it going to be in the way of something, or something going to be in the way of the greenhouse itself? The proximity to other infrastructure is important because you're dealing with certain issues like water, power, utilities other than those two that could affect how the greenhouse itself is run. So the slope is another important factor, if there's any at all. If you're flat, you have the best beginning to work with, but otherwise, if you have a slope, you have to make sure that slope is pointed in the direction you want the water to go. Obviously, water is going to find its level and it's going to go to the lowest point. And for any watering considerations, that water, if it needs to be diverted anywhere, you want that away from other infrastructure like the house or garage, something you don't want the water to pool under or affect in any negative way. So again, accessing water and power could be important if that's something that you need on a regular basis. That might be more for how you regulate automatic systems, but it's not necessarily based on the goals of the greenhouse itself. The shade or the sun is the next probably important factor, in my opinion. I think before you do any sort of groundwork, it's important to find out what the sun is doing throughout the day, where the shade, if any, is being impacted in the growing area, and then perhaps if you have enough of a change seasonally, that could affect how much sunlight is actually hitting the structure itself as well. The size of the structure is, how big of an operation do you want? Do you hope to grow plants to sell on a roadside, or is this for a personal collection that you're starting at home? It could be used for, any number of things. Propagating new plants from the store that you bought, or starting seeds for your vegetable garden pre-season. Really, whatever you can think of. And, those are the considerations, obviously, that you need to pay attention to when you're finding location and the setup of the greenhouse. The other thing with the size of the structure is, your relative cost to the project. How much are you willing to invest, and is it going to be a permanent structure, temporary structure? Do you want to just extend the growing season and use it specifically for vegetables, or do you hope to have a year-round growing collection, be it orchids or some other plant that people are interested in growing year-round that won't go inside the house in wintertime? Lastly, I think some of the last couple considerations are, before any groundwork is done, you want to check with your local permit office, because every state, county, local agency is going to be different. So definitely get all the necessary permits you might need for the structure that you're hoping to build. And then, of course, before any construction happens, you'll want to call before you dig, and that number is 511 if folks don't already know it. And with that, we'll run to the next section, which is basic design of a greenhouse. In this section, we're going to go over the basic design of your backyard greenhouse. Now, for this part, you're going to need a certain level of basic construction skills, either from a friend or family member, or depending on how deeply involved you want to get into the structure itself, there's always a general contractor that you can hire to do the work for you. Now, with that, um, the consideration that I feel is most important and long-lasting is the table setup where your plants are going to be. So you want them to support the maximum amount of weight that it is expected to hold, to include the plants, containers, the potting soil, and the trays they might be sitting in. If you have pebbles sitting in the bottom of those trays to increase humidity, all that stuff adds up in terms of weight. So you want to make sure that's sturdy enough to hold everything that you might put on it. Now, aside from the weight, you want a comfortable working height. Usually between 32 and 38 inches, a normal countertop height is what you'd be most comfortable with working. The point is, whoever's going to be doing most of the work on the benches, you don't want them to strain their back by reaching and bending over, doing whatever it is that they need to do. So for the next topic, the underneath storage of the tables that you build is always a good plus. You're maximizing the space, and it's space that's otherwise going unused. After that, then you're probably going to want to come up with some sort of cut list. Get all your supplies that you think you're going to need before you start. You don't want to start a project and realize you don't have everything that you need. These potting tables that I built, I did myself, and then also it's got a basic pressure-treated lumber squared off frame, and I measured the frame based on the width of, in this case what I used, a welded wire fencing. The benches themselves are as deep as the fence was tall, plus maybe an extra quarter inch around the edge so you don't have any metal sticking out. And then to attach it all together, I then used any type of basically weather-friendly fasteners. In this case, I used galvanized staples with some nylon coating just to kind of protect everything. And anyone that's working on the tables, they don't want to hurt themselves on that stuff. Now, after you consider the tables and the lumber selection and the weatherproof fasteners, the legs might be the next important from the height. I used kind of a floating shelf concept, and that seemed to work really best to keep things open and out of the way. When you set your posts, you want to set them according to the type of structure that it is, and you want to make sure it's deep enough to support the legs of the building structure. And another consideration is if you are close enough to another nearby structure, you can tie it in for additional rigidity if necessary, if it's, say, in an exposed spot where it's going to be hammered by the wind regularly. Those are all considerations to take into account. And with that, we'll jump into the next section. In the last segment, we discussed the tables and the general layout of the greenhouse. Well, in this segment, we're going to be talking about the design of the floor. Now, I'm just going to speak more directly to what I did. Every situation is going to be different for other folks, but I'm going to speak to this greenhouse here. So in my case, I do have somewhat of a gradual slope down and away from nearby infrastructure, and that's important in the sense that you are diverting water flow. And in my particular instance, I have a automatic irrigation system, which we'll talk about in a future segment, but the floor itself helps divert water away from the general growing area. And when I set the floor up, I used a tarp, just some general landscape tarp, and I put 2 layers down as a weed suppressant, and on top of that I used gravel Now the gravel is going to work in a variety of ways, and the objectives of the gravel are basically to eliminate any standing, pooling water, mostly for mosquitoes for me, but then also it acts as traction to allow anyone that's walking here, they don't slip and fall. It helps level out any unevenness on the ground if necessary. Now, the only other big talking point about having gravel on a slope, as you can imagine, is it's going to want to work its way down slope. So a way that I fixed that, the remedy was I just used simple pressure treated strips of 1/2 inch by 1 inch boards, and I secured those in place with regular landscape staples. The staples generally hold landscape fabric in place. Well, this acts the same way. It keeps the board from shifting, and then the gravel goes on top of the board, and it helps level out the surface, but it also acts as a mini retaining wall to hold that gravel in place. Lastly, for my purposes, for my growing objectives, the gravel with the added moisture on it increases the humidity of the growing area. It's not always beneficial depending on what you're growing, but in my case it is, so that's what I decided to go with. So in the last segment, we discussed the flooring of your potential backyard greenhouse. In this segment, we're actually now going to touch on the ceiling or roof and the walls of the structure. Now, when it comes to deciding what it is you hope to use to cover the sides and the top, you've got a lot of options, and that's going to be distilled down based on what you hope to accomplish and the size of the structure. Now, if you have to get into the permitting process and deal with local building codes, that's going to tell you what you need to accomplish your objectives. But for mine was meant to be a more temporary structure or seasonal use, and for what I decided to go with was a shade cloth, because when I first started out at the beginning of the growing season, I was in a telework status, and because of my job duties dealing with native plants, I set up the nursery or greenhouse to propagate native plants for use at NCTC. And once I brought those back into work, my goal then shifted into using it primarily for annuals or tropicals or orchids, as opposed to native plants. And to do that, the shade cloth really seemed like the best option for those objectives. Now, shade cloth itself comes in different ratings that are expressed as a percentage based on how much sunlight they filter. So anywhere, 30, 70%, and anywhere in between is kind of what you're going to find general purpose. And the type of material, depending on what it is going to last one season or multiple seasons if it comes down at the end of the season and gets put in storage. The walls themselves, for my purposes, I used a heavy-duty opaque tarp, kind of the same material that they use over the hoop houses or tunnel greenhouses, and I went with that because it's rugged, it's durable, but also it allows a fraction of the light to come in sideways as well. But primarily, it blocks any prevailing wind and helps minimize any potential wind damage to the plants that are growing in here. But because I have an open air type setting, it still kind of gets the maximum movement of air or airflow through the system, and that seems to work best for what I use it for. The other roofing structures that are worth considering can be like a hard but still opaque building type material that you just layer, that they might use on top of carports or some other similar design. If you block too much of the light, there's the potential for not getting enough sunlight to the plants. So if that doesn't work, based on the structure that you have, there's always the option for artificial lighting, which we'll go into in a different segment. You do want to minimize how stagnant the air is, because that can lead to certain pathogens, diseases, which are obviously not good for the plants themselves. And with that, we'll jump into the next section. Just whatever you consider, make sure that you're accounting for all the elements that are going to potentially affect the structure itself, either positive or negative. All right, in this section, we are now going to discuss power and water needs of your backyard greenhouse. That being said, power or water isn't going to be necessarily vital to the success of a backyard greenhouse. It's really, again, depending on what you hope to accomplish and how elaborate of a system or setup you want. In my case, since I'm not home all day every day, I did decide to go for an automatic watering system, and it's a real simple design. I basically have a garden hose coming out of a spigot out of the side of my house, and that runs to an electronic timer that is battery operated, and those valves shut on and off based on the time that you set for them to go off, and you can create different zones. It's really how elaborate you want to get with it. For my case, I went with a continuation of garden hose style tubing, and then at the end with the regular garden hose thread, set up with very basic, simple misting nozzles that just screw right in, and if need be, you can take them off to clean them and replace them as necessary. I went with the fogging nozzles, and based on what you find, they do come in different measurements, either droplet size or generally in gallons per minute, so it would be a volume measurement. And I went with a kind of a mid-range fogging nozzle because a lot of the plants that I was starting, either from seed or from cuttings or divisions, were younger, tender, so they needed a little bit more delicate watering. It didn't splash the soil out, it didn't harm the plants in any way, but it was able to give them regular watering as needed to get them growing appropriately. Now for the power side of things, that comes into play when you add additional things that require power, either artificial lighting if necessary, or in my case, I decided to increase airflow with an oscillating fan that I have operating pretty much all the time, and that reduces any stagnant air, keeps things moving, especially as the humidity tends to increase within the greenhouse. Now, if you don't have power or water, or you decide not to go with that as an option, have no fear. A simple garden hose watering on a regular basis will get you exactly the results that you need based on your watering style. So aside from the power and water aspect, where your water comes from might be as critical, if not more important, than how the water itself is being delivered. I'm off well water personally, but there's also city water, and there's also rainwater collectment, which is, I think, the best. But when you're dealing with water sources that have added salts or minerals, you want to make sure you take that into consideration with the plants you're watering. That could increase maintenance on your equipment, meaning if you have a calcium buildup, you'll want to clean that out regularly, or if there's higher mineral content that might be detrimental to the plants, you want to be aware of that ahead of time. So it's really just dependent on, again, your final goals to meet your objectives, and yeah, I think the rest is pretty good. In conclusion, depending on your backyard greenhouse needs, you can make it a multifunctional space, and as long as you meet the needs of your goals and objectives, and you know, the plants that you decide to grow, whether it's new starts or you know, seasonal vegetable gardening, or you know, some other tropical plant orchid use, the point is to be able to have fun with it, make it your own. It can be modular, seasonal. You can take it down at the end of the season, put it back up. But the bottom line is just have fun with it. And whatever you decide to do, just know that there's plenty of resources online. And you know, on behalf of the Potomac Valley Audubon Society, I just want to say thanks for tuning in for this program, this monthly program, and we hope to see you again next time. Thanks.